and we know the sting of God's delay in our desperation. Now, in the passage this morning, God's people are suffering under an oppressive regime. But I wanted to just highlight that there are other types of suffering that we go through on our road to glory. There's physical and emotional suffering, chronic debilitating illness, depression, anxiety that leave us asking things like, how can I even carry on? My body's failing me. My mind is failing me. And it feels like the darkness just won't lift. There are relational burdens that we carry when we sin against one another. We cut each other deeply. We turn our backs on each other. We let each other down. And it leaves us asking things like, how can they even forgive me? How can I even forgive them? We feel the broken fellowship. There are societal burdens, much like what we see in this passage in Exodus. Oppression, systemic injustice, persecution, which leave us asking, when is it going to get better? When will this injustice no longer be part of my daily experience? And there are spiritual burdens, guilt, fear, apathy, doubt, which leave us asking, what do I do with this weight of guilt? What if God doesn't intervene? Why can't I feel anything? And what if God isn't there? The burdens that we carry in this life are real burdens. And they're burdens that people in this room, in our community, are experiencing. The sheer amount of suffering represented in this room is astonishing because we don't have a large congregation. I'm talking less than 100 people, and this is a generic list of some of the things that people in this room are experiencing. Chronic debilitating illness diagnosed at a young age. Chronic debilitating illness diagnosed in your golden years. Joblessness, kids with paralyzing anxiety. Tragic loss of loved ones, car accidents, cancer, gun violence and miscarriage, suicide, infertility, deep betrayal from friends, from spouses, people that we've shared deep intimacy with, walking away, and sins that have been planted deep in our biology, addiction, crisis of sexuality and identity, depression. There are people in this room, in our body, struggling daily under these burdens, wondering when or if God will relieve them. And there are people who have all but shipwrecked their faith under the weight of this burden, who have said, let me go back to Egypt because it was better for me there.
Yeah, that's true.
The suffering of God's people is real suffering. The burdens are real burdens.
Yes. Yes.
And if it's not you, it's likely the person next to you.
Amen.
So with Moses, we ask, why doesn't God deliver? Why doesn't God come and rescue us? So I want to focus on 2 points this morning. First, I want us to look at Satan at work in our suffering. And then second, we're going to look at God at work in our suffering. So in our passage this morning, you can see a few specific ways that Satan is at work in the suffering of God's people in Egypt. Now, it may seem somewhat counterintuitive, but Satan's primary goal in our suffering is not just to maximize the amount of suffering that God's people endure, right? His goal is to influence the way we respond to the suffering that we experience in this life. We will all go through valleys. We all have a cross to bear. And Satan's work is to influence the way that we respond to it. He wants us to respond in desperation and escape rather than in faith and in hope.
Yeah.
So the way that he does that, there are 4 ways that he does that in this passage: diversion, deception, division, and discouragement. So first, diversion. I don't have verse references, but it's in there. Essentially, Pharaoh says, God's people are idle. Let heavier work be laid on them. He's trying to divert their attention from the hope that they have in God of sure deliverance from their suffering. So he lays on work on them. Deception in verse 9. I will read this one. In verse 9, Pharaoh says, let heavier work be laid on the men, that they may labor at it, and pay no regard to lying words. Does this sound like Satan in the garden? Surely God did not say if you eat of the fruit of the tree in the middle of the garden that you'll die. Satan wants us to believe that we don't have hope in God, that though he may promise us deliverance, his promises are empty. He uses deception to influence the way we respond to our suffering. And third, division. You see that in our passage this morning, God's people were scattered when Pharaoh tells them to go collect their own straw. Satan uses division within the people of God to influence the way we respond to our suffering. And then lastly, discouragement. All of these tactics are meant to discourage us and to crush the hope that we have of deliverance from our suffering.